Many there are who have never heard of the great self within, the Atman. Many others, though they hear of it, fail to comprehend it. Fortunate is that one who hears of it. Wonderful is the one who speaks of it. And extremely blessed is that one who, having heard of it from the lips of an illumined preceptor, is able to realize it here and now, in this very lifetime. Om, peace, peace, peace. Peace be unto us, and peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. And so the Upanishads, which I've just chanted from, tell us that we need to spread the word about the great self existing within. The world is based mostly on the small self. We know that word in Sanskrit to be ahamkara. And so the small ego gets worshipped by most people as the only self. But even though the Buddhists are a bit particular about the word self, nonetheless, Lord Buddha used that very word in the Dhammapada in the early Buddhist scriptures, talking about making the decision between the great self and the small self. So that's a teaching that is eternal, and we can look back on to always help ourselves remember to separate that wheat from the chaff, as Jesus was to say, about 500 years later, after Lord Buddha. So this art of discriminating between the real and the unreal comes to us even earlier than both of them in the Vedic period, where these Upanishads began to announce in no uncertain terms about the existence of the self, being the only real existence. So our quest and our work nowadays needs to include the spreading of the word around the world of this good news that Vedanta holds out of the existence of the great self and placing one's mind upon it. Call that Atman, and sometimes they say, well, there's seems to be two words, at least, maybe more, for God or for reality in Vedanta, Atman and Brahman. But those two are one and the same. And we know that in the case of the Atman, it has the ability to take on coverings or sheaths or enter into the worlds of name and form in time and space. Although it never really associates, it never really identifies with them, as we like to say, using Shankara's wordage, but it is able to associate with them, whereas Brahman is more an all-pervasive verity. It's like sweetness in sugarcane juice, as Sri Ramakrishna used to describe it. So you could see that it would be more readily available to most people to think about a term like the self, and also begin to notice the distinction between the ego self, which is attracted to name and form and is taking births, as we've been studying in the Sunday classes over the last 3 or 4 weeks. This process of rebirth that's going on in a sort of like a tempest in a teapot. And the recurrence of the small self becoming problematic in the case of suffering that everyone is aware of, who is aware of the more sensitive side of spirituality and the truer side of religion. Difference between religion and irreligion was noticed by Swami Vivekananda when he came west, particularly. And so he was very much in favor of this spreading of the word of the Atman. So many have never even heard of it. So we think of millions and maybe even billions of people who have not yet had that definitive spiritual awakening to know about this eternal, undying, unborn self that exists within us. That's our true nature, they call it. Others have heard of it and then fail to comprehend it. So that follows nicely with the teachings of both the father of Vedanta, Vedavyas, and father of yoga, Patanjali, because they both commented on these different kinds of yogis and yoginis who are becoming aware of the Atman. Another word you might use for it would be, in a more general sense, is Chaitanya, or consciousness itself, becoming aware of awareness or becoming conscious of consciousness. And in that way, beginning to savor or look inward towards those subtler spiritual climes that they call lokas, or realms, the realms of spirituality, or the kingdoms of heaven within, and therefore come forth with a few of these gems. Dive deep, O mind, dive deep into the ocean of God's beauty. If you descend to the uttermost depths, there you will find the gem of love. So in that way, they sing about it, they write about it in the scriptures, and we come in possession of the higher knowledge called Atmagyan, which will allow us to focus in on the self, when previous to that, there might have been lifetimes even with these beings who have never heard of the self, and also possibly lifetimes of striving called sadhana, or spiritual self-effort, in which some souls are beginning to take upon themselves the quest, the spiritual journey, to awaken themselves to deeper and higher verity called Brahman. Like putting your kite up into the air, or diving deep into the ocean of God's love. This path of non-duality and this path of bhakti, which are one God, Vivekananda calls them, can't be deceived by the fact that there are different ways in which to get to this highest reality. That's actually according to the temperaments and the character and the karmas and the situations, the samskaras, if you know the word, of different people around the world. So the various religions are just wells with the same water in them. And that water is one and the same. And it's indivisible, particularly when it comes to a boundless ocean of consciousness. Or if you want to use the kite in the air or the bird in the air, Sri Ramakrishna used to speak about that a lot too, that the bird flies high in the sky. Sometimes it comes to rest on a branch. And it also flies high in the sky the next day, but it finds that it can go even higher. There's no limit to the width and breadth and depth and girth of that great light of Brahman, into which my mind fell like a hailstone into an ocean, Shankara tells us in the Vivekachudamani. So all of these, not only worth pondering, but actually make up the paragatam, as Buddha called it, the goal of all goals, the supreme goal in which the human being is trying to divine, is a good word, is trying to define the existence of the great self within, and return to its depths or its heights, whichever way you want to look at it. So the heights of non-dual reality are the depths of that ocean of bhakti, the love for God. That's one thing. And as Vedantists, we know that we have been given almost the direct permission by this recent visitation of God in the highest form called avatar, when Sri Ramakrishna has told us that both of these avenues are open to us. And his most mature spiritual opinion is that the human being starts off as at the Nietzsche. It is eternal. And then it descends into the Leela when it wants to sport, take form. And then after the sport is over, like any child in the neighborhood after school playing, becomes dark, then it returns home. So in that same case, from the Nietzsche to the Leela, and then from the play of or sport of divine reality back to the Nietzsche, that's this you might say main movement, if you could assign movement to Brahman at all, because sometimes Sri Krishna would say it's like a snake. It's completely immobile and sitting there. You might think it's a stick. It doesn't move for long periods of time. All of a sudden, it will slither across the floor. So he's describing Brahman and Shakti, the static and dynamic power of consciousness. So we have the direct permission, I was saying, to plumb the depths of that consciousness and fearlessly go into this non-dual space, or akasha, the chid akasha, or the mahakasha, Sri Ramakrishna called it. And he said that he liked to dissolve himself there, and then Mother would bring him back into the realm of name and form, and he would try and re-identify with the names and forms that came forward to him. Sometimes he couldn't even remember Narendra, his own favorite, loving, direct disciple there, who was to be Swami Vivekananda, because his mind had been so immersed in formlessness that when he came down to the Leela to sport, then forms seemed rather alien to him. And then he had to spend some time there and place his mind upon those forms and bring back the divine memory of the association of God in form, so that everything then turned into Brahman for him. Like putting on colored glasses, he said, everything turns a certain color. So when you have that experience of non-dual reality, then you can come out of that and look everywhere and see nothing but Brahman. You won't see objects anymore. You'll see Brahman as objects. So that's one of the beauties of the Vedanta. And we're encouraged, which just seems to be the flavor of this whole satsang today, encouraged to spread it to those who have not yet heard of it. And to those who have, who are striving, then we're encouraged to help them. Encourage them along the path and do away with these lower tendencies of jealousy and so forth. Feel happy for the success that people make in life, particularly along the spiritual level. Guide them towards that, point them in that direction, and support them. So much so that you have Swami Vivekananda saying, Mukti, moksha, what's that? Freedom. We can have that anytime. Right now, we need to help other people out of suffering. So let's put off our moksha and our mukti, and let's put off all of these high flights of realization that are for the self alone, because there's only one self once you reach it. And all other selves merge in that. So that could be a sort of spiritual selfishness. And so in his opinion, when he came here and saw the world, probably after 1,000 years of being in a formless state, because Holy Mother used to say, Naren, this Vivekananda, when he gets out of the body, he'll sit like a wooden statue for 1,000 years, entirely immovable, and then come back and take a peek at what's happening in the world. So when he saw the world in this age, which we're glad he did, take a little notice of us, then he saw that suffering was prevalent, that the ark of the world was sinking in the ocean of lust and greed, as one song puts it, that one of his brother monks wrote. And so down he came. That is, really out he came from inside of that 1,000 years of meditation at the behest of Sri Ramakrishna, who came to him in the form of a bright, shining little child and asked him to come down to the Burloka and out to the Burloka and take notice of the suffering here. It's all written down beautifully in songs, which are the contemporary scriptures of today. You just wait a while and you'll see that that will become the case, that the new scriptures, the new Ramakrishna Upanishad has been written, and it won't be long before it's spread far and wide. And we'll know what happened to us to a certain extent. And may we all become Ishvara Kotis at that point. That is, maybe become very good at tracing the movement of the avatar as it comes and goes. Krishna says that also in the Gita, Utkramantan Vyapi and Napushanti Atma Jnana Chakshushaha. So he goes, may this third eye in beings open up, Jnana Chakshushi. And then they'll notice the movement of the Lord as he comes and he goes. The rest, the deluded, Vimudda calls them, they don't see the Lord as he comes and he goes amongst forms and worlds. Only those who have opened the inner eye of wisdom see. So maybe we become those, like those Ishvara Kotis that watch for that huge movement, like you might say the great tidal wave that will mount on an ocean every once in a while and absorb other smaller waves into it. So a spiritual awakening, that's more common than that kind of highest realization. Spiritual awakening in any given lifetime, but more common than spiritual awakening is falling back to sleep, unfortunately. So that was the nature of one of my God blogs that we'll look at in a couple hours here last week. So we'd like to rectify that and make sure that beings, if they have a spiritual awakening, will stay awake. So that's the import of that Upanishadic sloka I just chanted. Many have never heard of the self. Others have heard of it, but they fail to recognize it or fail to realize it. So if you have awakened spiritually, then must come fully awake and stay awake. Get that insomnia of yoga, as our founder, like Sixon, used to talk about, where you're in an ever awake state. Because that third eye, that Jnana Chakshu we're just talking about, is ever awake and always open in the Lord and in the Mother of the universe. So that's why we head for higher climes like swans, Lord Buddha said. Head for this higher chakras. The heart opens up, then we have permission to go deeper and further into the depths of our own consciousness and plumb them, explore them. It's a great adventure of consciousness, it's been called. So here at Satsang, maybe a few questions have been brought, because that's what, that's a sign of intelligence. Questioning is a sign of intelligence. So we want to always know more and more about this Brahman, about this Atman. Imre, yes. Thank you.
Namaste, Babaji, and Namaste. I would like to ask a question about how we could approach a difference between abstraction that we live through our studies and definitely a scientific approach, and let's say philosophical essentialism. So, and at the same time, I would like to, or that's kind of a quest to find the bridging, the overlap between them, because definitely they are integrate. But so I would like to, if you could shed light upon the slight differentiation, and in this sense, probably it's the question of aparavidya and paravidya, or the vidya and paravidya issue. So, what are those qualities that are reassuring of the first and the other?
Well, we take in the Advaitic teachings if we can, and they usually aren't to be given out to people who haven't yet had a spiritual awakening. They usually should start at the lower knowledge, aparavidya, and that's naturally happening as we look around the world. Aparavidya, that knowledge is being used for practical means, for people making a living, raising families, and doing their jobs. And there's a learning curve, as they say, that goes on there in aparavidya that extends everywhere from the worker on up to the scientist and everything in between. There's kind of levels of consciousness vibrating in the one section or segment called aparavidya. That's a boon from Divine Mother Shakti. She'll give to souls in the worlds everything that they need to conduct themselves and to protect themselves, their precious existence, and try to fulfill themselves until such a time when name and form have become plodding, pedantic, of little use or interest anymore. There's always a thirst for life. That's why Vivekananda says, this thirst for life forever quench, because it drags from birth to death and death to birth to soul. So we're to think then that if the soul gets tired of being drugged here and there into the form of an infant, and then into the form of an old man, and then go formless again, and all the time not knowing about this formlessness that's beyond name and form, as Krishna talks about in the Gita. He said, my true nature is beyond Prakriti, and it's also beyond the life force which supports all the worlds. So he gives us a key there, because there's nature and people get attracted to that, Prakriti, and that's where the Paravidya becomes handy, because then you can find out about where you are, what's happening here, what's going on. And like I say, from the workman who uses Prakriti for his occupation, all the way up to scientist who begins to study Prakriti as if it has some secret in it, and then graduating beyond that to having learned everything. Like, I've had my bath, I want to get out. If I stay in this bath any longer, my skin will wrinkle. So at one point, the soul wants to get out of the purification process. The gymnasium of the soul, Vivekananda called it. The world is just a gymnasium of the soul, where you work out your issues and build your muscles and so forth. So this higher goal we're talking about, that always needs to be indicated, and you beat a fast retreat from Maya when it becomes a matter of bondage of the soul. And then you reach for this higher level of consciousness, this deeper level of consciousness. And then you're going to need to know about the para vidya. So if you put it in terms of jnanam, knowledge or wisdom, everything here is really made out of that. It's all made out of knowledge, and it proceeds by knowledge, and it goes back to knowledge. So if you put it in terms of jnanam, then of course there's ajnanam, which is ignorance, and then you have pravritti jnana. That means knowledge of, it's like a paravidya, pravritti, how making your living and so forth, that kind of knowledge. And then nivritti jnana, the next level, that means you're done with duties and works, and that's not very commonly presented to us in the West. you just retire and you take up a hobby or something, or you go traveling. But to get to actually nivritti means to, that's the knowledge that takes away your desire for lower things that you had before. You've already fulfilled those. If you lived enough lifetimes, there's a sort of ennui, they call it, or sort of world weariness that comes over the soul. And if the paravidya is there, which it isn't in our society and in our Western world in these days, then you have some place higher and better to go. You don't retire. And you don't reincarnate either. You're being think in terms of an eternal existence, which is your final resting place. You want to sit on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the Lord in a higher heaven and not go anywhere anymore, or merge completely like a hailstone into the ocean, I was saying. So that's where the paravidya becomes unveiled to souls who realize the ephemeral and transitory nature of the worlds of name and form, and finally have that definitive realization that nothing here can satisfy you, that it all came from yourself. So that's why I used to say, you look out and you say, I want this, but you just produced it from inside yourself. So you had it already. So it's very strange to project a world of name and form and then watch it manifest outside of yourself and say, I want that, because it was yours to begin with. You projected it. Now you're just going to have to go out and experience it. And that's what people do. But they don't do it with that foreknowledge that it all came out of the mind, that the mind is the vibrating hub of everything, and that nature, prakriti, as seeds are in the mind. And when you water them with the power of your will and your thought, then they turn into names and forms. So that's not something that people sit around and think about, like we bring up all the time at satsang or in class. The mind only schools. So when that becomes a forceful fact of existence, that that's what's happening, then the soul begins to define itself as transcendent of all of nature. All activity takes place in nature, Arjuna, Krishna says in the Gita, not in you. So the soul's inactive. So when this becomes clear, finally, the soul drops duties and drops works. Vivekananda has a very good way of talking about this. And Krishna, through the series of the 18 chapters of the Gita, is really talking a lot about that, how to get jnanam, karma jnanam, and then finally sannyas. The soul goes through these levels of giving up desire for things that it realizes it already has. So it's not into that that play of pretend, of putting masks on and taking them off all the time. It would rather just live in one state with that third eye open, as we were talking about earlier. And so the paravidya becomes prevalent there because it's infinite and boundless. And this is what you see. Beings who own nothing, have nothing, don't even know where their next meal's coming from. These great souls are looking inside and seeing something that most other beings aren't. And they're spending all their hours and every breath and entire lifetime looking at something most beings don't see. They're actually looking inside and are completely focused upon something that's bringing them delight or ananda, vilapya shantim, eternal peace, param bhajasva, the supreme joy. And they don't move to go get it, and they're not out of balance, unless their mind moves away from that. We watched Sri Ramakrishna go through those abstract moods when they were described very well by people like Mahendranath Gupta in the Gospel and so forth, how he would be at this ecstatic bliss, and then he'd try and bring his mind down to the realm of thought. And then he would have to be concerned for your welfare, because you're sitting there in front of them, in front of him, thinking of something untoward, thinking of something that's mayic, thinking of something that doesn't exist, thinking of something that you don't need to brood on because it's not real. And then, you see, you can't understand that you're spending your precious time doing that when you could be looking in across the expanse of this broad ocean of Atman that completely takes the mind and immerses it in the light of Brahman. So at that point, you wave goodbye to the lower realms of Agyanam, and you take your place amongst the knowers of Brahman, and in the Atmagyan. It's like saying a Paravidya and Paravidya. So where the two sectors meet, that's where the mind is thinking and the mind is conceiving. It's going to produce these worlds of name and form in time and space, and it's going to need knowledge of all the things it's producing. So it'll plant secrets there for people to discover, and people will discover them, like scientists and so forth, and they'll be so surprised that they thought they discovered something new, but it was those very beings who put those secrets in nature to find later, so that they had something to support themselves with when they got into the body. It's all precognitive wisdom, and the way we look at it. It's everything has already been done, and the same you'll find is true with your enlightenment. That's already a fact. That's one of the rules, of course, of non-duality. But to say that you don't have to struggle a little bit when you're here to realize that is an error in evaluation by pseudo-non-dualists. You have to struggle very hard to get out of that cocoon of karma that you wove about yourself in previous lifetimes that made you project these worlds, get into them as if they were real, and then go through this necessary process of getting free. So bondage and freedom become a duality that one ponders after a while. Pretty soon they don't say, oh, I'm going to get free, because that means they were once bound. But when they found out that the soul is ever free and never bound, then they couldn't say that anymore. They knew that they were always free. It was just a matter of whether their mind was projecting worlds or not. And if they projected the worlds and got into it and kept knowledge of that, both apara, lower knowledge, and paravidya, you kept that knowledge that everything comes from the self. What is it? The second or third law of yoga is all knowledge dwells within you. So that's like Jesus saying, the kingdoms of heaven are within you, because those are all made out of knowledge, you see. So it can be approached through different ways, but this way that you're asking about, paravidya and aparavidya, is a part, or should be a part of the dharmic assistance. That is, the teachings of the Dharma that every soul who comes to earth should be armed with. They should have both para and aparavidya. Aparavidya will soon become outstripped by paravidya, and it's just like a rocket dropping a stage that it doesn't need anymore. It's just dead weight. So that's why Swami Vivekananda would say that, work, is a duty, is the hot midday sun that's burning the very vitals of humanity. It's useful for a while, but then it's a morbid dream. I think I got that almost exactly how he quoted it. Duty is a midday sun that's burning the very vitals of humanity. It's necessary for a time, then it's a morbid dream. So this is to make sure that this isn't to criticize people doing works and activity because they're still at the level of a paravidya, but it is to say that soon you will find that the worlds, if you want to jump to the chase, are not real, are not actual. They're projections, and projections don't have any substance to them. And at that point, you're going to need to have this paravidya, if not already well in hand, at least come into view in your journey. Oh, now I remember where I'm from. Now I remember where I'm going. Now I remember who I am. No problem. And you'll drop that stage of the rocket called a paravidya. And that's defining a soul, a seer, you see, right there. That's a good definition of a seer or a realized soul, the state they're living in without all these weights. And, even if they're holding weights, they know what that weight is and how to use it, how to balance it. Yeah, all the Hungarians have the question.
Well, I think it's only a coincidence. I have a question in regards to what I was reading from the Gospel. It's about analogy that Sri Ramakrishna put about how, well, there are certain reasons that a spiritual practice doesn't reach fulfillment, and he likened that to farmers who cultivate their fields, but have like holes leaking out, holes in the walls of their fields, and that the water would leak out these walls and cause their work to become futile. And I would like to ask, he likened these to desires, that desires are the cause for spiritual practices to not fructify, or not bring the results of one's spiritual practice. And well, as a householder and as commoners as we are, we do have a lot of desires in our everyday life. And are there certain desires that are particularly dangerous for a spiritual aspirant? Or can you expand on this query that I'm having in regards to this?
If you're fully committed to your path and your ishtam, then there's no desire that can hurt you. There are desires that can detain you. You've got this highest ideal in mind, and your heart's given to it, but your body and your karmas are lagging behind still. You have a penchant towards some attachment to old things, and can't give them up readily and quickly. So Holy Mother used to say that not even God can hurt my devotees, she'd say. So if you've found a great being like Holy Mother, and she would tell you is that those desires you still have, they're mere nothings. Just think about me and do your sadhana. So this is how the last stages of that rocket get dropped. That is, the householder who's still, who knows about Dharma, but who still has thoughts of adharma lingering in the mind. They call those like burnt ropes, that they can't really bind you anymore, but you're thinking about them, and the danger there is that they'll detain you in your forward progress. That's called alabdha bhumikatva. It's a long word, but Father of Yoga called it anavasti tattvani too. It means that you take one step back forward and you always fall 2 steps back. So you are making progress, but in the end, these old things are dragging you back to the stage that you were before, and you can't seem to make any real definitive progress to get beyond the problem itself. And so the solution, I think I heard in your questions how to stop those leaks that are in the irrigation channels of your field. I think we had maybe 1 or 2 God blogs on that over the last 3 weeks about farmers digging irrigation channels to their fields. So, and we also had mention of Sri Ramakrishna's story about how if you take honey and put it, in a small clay jar, you see, and just put it there. Then later you come back and some of the honey is seeping out of the clay jar and it's gathering around on the surface because you didn't see these small cracks in the clay jar. And so you could say, well, I need to pour this into something that has less leaks in it. So that clay jar is the old body-mind mechanism with its old karmas, and it's still got leaks in its fidelity to the Ishtam, like brahmacharya. It doesn't keeping its brahmacharya steady, or like any of the yamas and niyamas of yoga, like truthfulness. It's deviating once in a while from truth. It's deviating once in a while from the problem of covetousness, asteya. And it's breaking little rules behind its own back, you see. So the overall solution would be just to take that cup, that clay cup, and just drop it in a vat of honey. See, I mean, instead of trying to repair the leaks, which some people try and do, and good luck with that, depending on their ability. And you could just pick up the whole cup and just drop it in a vat of honey. Yeah. I think the God blog we were talking about earlier last week was how, if you take a cup of water or a vase of water and put it next to the river, the sun will evaporate it pretty soon. You see, all the water evaporates out of the body, out of the bottle. But basically, if you take that bottle and just put it in the river, then it's not possible for it to evaporate. So that's the solution overall, is you just give yourself 100%. It's what we just chanted. Shravanayapi buhu bir yona labhyaha shrinvato pi bahavo yamna vidyuhu. Vidyuhu is wisdom. So you take that body-mind mechanism that is problematic and is erring, and you dedicate it entirely, shravana, you dedicate it entirely to the path and the goal and the Ishtam, the Guru, and Brahman. And so there won't be any chance of anything that you're storing up, your yogic powers that you're storing up through practice won't leach away anymore. That won't be taken away or won't evaporate by the problems of the ego mind mechanism. So this is the greatest of all solutions if one can manage it. It's a complete offering of the self into Brahman. Om Tatsnayo Ra Vrinni Mahe Gatum Yogyaya Gatum Yenapate. May we make a sincere and humble offering of the small self into the great self. So to the extent that we can make this offering complete, to that extent, then we will be able to retain all the powers that we store up through our yogic practices. And we won't be detained then from reaching the goal of spiritual life in this very lifetime. So recommit yourself every day with every breath to that Brahman, that ishtam, to your path and to your practices. It's always a matter of intensification, but we know that before you intensify, there has to be clarification. So those two things going together will ensure that you make swift progress and reach the goal. You know what this mudra is, right? It's a new mudra I invented. Can we just make a little bit of progress this lifetime? You look out on the world, you see, can we just make a little bit of progress? What I'm just talking about is the whole ball of wax, where you just put yourself into your ishtam and be your ishtam. You put yourself into Brahman and be Brahman. And to the extent you can practice that with the least restraints and the least shortcomings and the least amount of lost energy, to that extent, you will grow by leaps and bounds, they say. But maybe some beings just has to make a little progress to eke out enough room in their narrow minds and their selfish egos to just get a glimpse of the light of Brahman. And maybe that will be enough to afford them a more definitive move out of Maya, out of ignorance, and begin that process of self-realization after spiritual awakening occurs. We can talk more about that at God Blogs, because there's one God blog about that. It's back to Imre's question about aparavidya, where you can go to school and try and soak up the lower knowledge. And there's more knowledge there than you can ever hope to gather. So you come home each day from school and you say, how much did I gather? How much do I know? How much more do I know now than I did yesterday? And a week goes by and months of schooling goes by, and you have to kind of assess and trying to put a definitive value on what you gained in the aparavidya and how much it helped you. So if you can do that in a discriminated way, then you can master, as some people do, certain occupations or certain movements of the aparavidya. Become a great mathematician or become a great scientist and so forth. But measuring the spiritual progress by the accumulation of paravidya is much less chancy, much less risky, and much more satisfying. A little bit of that light, even a drop of her wisdom, the song sings, will turn a man into a god and a woman into a goddess. So that's the beautiful grace of the Lord and Mother of the universe when we turn our attention to them, when we put ourselves fully into their care. Our self-surrender is 100% there. And then even a drop of that light, or that nectar they call Amrit, even a drop of that nectar will fall upon the heart and mind of the aspirant, the devotee. And that will be enough to break the camel's back. The camel in that case being Maya. See, then Maya will go away. And then I become rich with the whole terrain of consciousness, as Ram Prasad sings in one of his songs. Oh, Mother, make me rich with all the wealth of knowledge that you possess. Yes, Annapurna.
I've been talking with a friend who's come out of a Pentecostal tradition, and it got me to thinking about the nature of emotion in spiritual life. And early on in Vedanta, I was taught to try and keep emotion out of meditation practice. And yet we also know that emotion is galvanizing, and it focuses the mind when you have love for your Ishtam. And then we also hear, I'm trying to give full context here, then we also hear, even in our own tradition, of people who, through devotional singing, through devotional dancing, etc., they kind of rile themselves up, so to speak, in devotion to God, and probably have some inner experiences, but depending upon their overall quality of consciousness and the gunas that are in play, they fall back down from that and maybe even just do very, very worldly, unskillful things afterwards. So we're told about that too. So the hallmark has been, that I understand, is what you were just talking about, that how do these experiences manifest in terms of true spiritual attainment or building of character, increase of virtue, etc. And if they don't show that, is it also possible that enough of those experiences, if they're brought about through sincerity, that they actually begin to thin the wall between, that would lead to a higher experience and more of a quote unquote result of building character and more spiritual attainment? That's my question.
It's a lot like Abhinay's question about the leaks in the cup, in the clay cup. In the same case, Lord Buddha used to say, drops of Dharma, raindrops, the Dharma mega samadhi, the rain cloud of virtues, it was called. They're following all the time, and worldly people don't know about this special rainfall that's falling on their heads all the time. But the spiritual awakened souls, they know that there's this rainfall of Dharma that's happening, and drops are falling everywhere. So you could just enjoy those drops on you, some sort of like liquid bliss that's cooling you and satisfying your thirst. Or you could go get a bucket, Lord Buddha said, and collect some of them. So if you have a bucket, that's called a spiritual practice. And when this rainfall is falling of Dharma, then you've got a bucket, you're collecting it. This means when you practice, you're actually saving and storing up a lot of those, what I just called the powers of yogic practice. You're saving those up inside of you, and those can grow, as we've seen in the great souls like Lord Buddha, to just an infinite proportion, where they become themselves receptacles and storehouses of this amazing light and spiritual experience itself. So as far as thinning a veil goes, there's a definitive moment that all of this effort and seeking begins to become unnecessary. Some souls will keep it up just as an example for others to keep doing it until they reach that definitive moment. But there's a definitive moment where one can just rest on one's laurels, as it were, spiritually speaking. And in the meantime, the thinning and the thickening of a veil, of a cloud of unknowing, or a curtain of nescience that's going on between the soul's identity as Brahman and the soul's parley with the worlds of name and form and Maya, and the small self, the ego. That for the illumined souls, that again is no problem. They just notice how thick the delusion is in any given age, in any given country, any like in the collective mind of people on Earth, maybe just take Earth alone. And so they use it as a barometer to see how much light is actually available at any given cycle of time in the world to people who are suffering or people who are seeking. But what I'm saying here is at a certain time, then all of that becomes quite vexing and not necessarily anymore. And back to Imre's question, this Paravijja alone is going to be all they require to remember themselves. And so, as our Sunday classes have been, this how the divine memory plays a role in the process of reincarnation is what we've been talking about for 3 Sundays now, and go on talking about tomorrow. So for them, then, it's a matter of this divine memory becoming accessible and easily operable, so that everything in Vedanta can just be done with the mind. Sure, at some point, even though Shankara says hundreds and thousands of asanas cannot get you enlightenment, somewhere in that process of your growth, asana helped you. And certainly, though hundreds and thousands of pranayama, breathing exercises, cannot get you enlightenment, nevertheless, somewhere in the process of your sadhana, pranayama is helpful to you. And so all of this is, of course, the realm of self-effort and striving, seeking that which is already yours. And so it all becomes a matter of thinning that curtain of nescience between you and who you truly are. It's a curtain that you mounted yourself. It's self-actuated. And nonetheless, the Atman is self-luminous and self-contained. It's all in all. It's one. So it has everything within it that it needs. And out here, that has become expressed, you see, in name and form. But inside, it's still contained inside of seed form. So it's very easy to contain it. That's why the self is all contained in self-luminous. It has all of that within it. And so the only risk then becomes in going out, in incarnating, in taking a form, in seizing a name and giving it to yourself, or getting caught in the cycle of time, or playing in the cycle of time and moving into space. That's all done in the Lord's Maya. So one has to become very adept then at keeping that essential bit of knowledge. The self is all in all, and none else exists in mind from time immemorial, and in every second and every breath has that one thought on its mind alone, which is how we started off this satsang, saying, that some have never heard of it, others have heard of it but failed to comprehend it. But wonderful is that one who speaks of it, and blessed is that one who has heard of it from the lips of the illumined ones and realized it here in this very life. So may peace be upon us. May higher wisdom dawn upon us. May all see the face of truth and be fortified by the armor of love. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us. May peace be unto all. Om Hari Om Hari Om Hari Om Tat Sat.